What does a business school professor and author, mountain running, the Sarik study, and my terrible music abilities have to say about why you'll most likely bomb in your job interview? Stick around and find out. Before I get into the details of this Stanford study, I want to run an experiment by you and relax. It'll just take a second. But I want to do this so you can understand what this has to do with the connection to your job interviews. So here's the rules. I'm going to tap out one song from a list of songs that I'm going to put here on the screen. And then you have to guess what it is. Are you ready? Okay, here goes. Did you get it? Leave a comment below. I'd be very curious to hear what songs people thought they heard. For the record, it was Jingle Bells. In the original Stanford study, dubbed the Sarik effect, 120 songs were tapped out, and the students guessed that about 60 of them would be correctly identified, or roughly 50%. In reality, it was 3 songs, or 2.5%. Hopefully some of you left your guesses below in the comments. I'll be very curious to see how the percentages play out for this video. So there I was running on a mountain trail, listening to the Audible book from Adam Grant called Originals, and he introduced this research in his book. My stated goal with this channel is to help 100,000 people land their dream job. And the Sarik effect really helps explain a point that I try to make to all of my customers when I tell them about or try to explain to them why their stories didn't quite land in their interviews the way they thought it did. It all boils down to perception, yours and the interviewers. Most of the time, we as humans are way overconfident in our predictions about the reality of what others hear when we're saying something. If you were to try and take this same experiment and tap out a song, the one thing I can say with 100% certainty is this. You won't be able to tap out the song without hearing it play in your mind. Why is this important? Because since you're hearing the song in your head, it's impossible for you to hear the disjointed melody of taps that you're banging on the table. The person listening to you cannot hear the music in your head. They just hear the taps. This is the exact same problem when you're telling a story in your job interviews. When you're relating a story, you're replaying the events that happened from your experience. You are basically watching a film strip of images in your mind. But you didn't just see the movie. You wrote the movie. Remember, this is a story that you have more than likely prepared ahead of time to use in your job interview. You may have spent, hours, days, or even weeks thinking about this story and how you want to talk about it in your job interview. You know the outcome, the plot, and all of the characters so intimately, it's impossible for you to imagine what it must be like to hear that story for the first time. You and the interviewer don't share the same information as a starting point. That information asymmetry, it essentially means the two of you are watching fundamentally different movies. And all of the pieces that you left out, well, a good interviewer will be trying to fill that in as best as they can because they're trying to make sense of your story. And the outcome is that you are under communicating the facts of the story. In fact, these plot points are so familiar to you that you're going to underestimate what is needed for the interviewer to fully comprehend the story and therefore buy into this idea that you're a highly desirable candidate for this role at this company. And the reason for this is you haven't focused on the questions that matter. Therefore, how can the interviewer be expected to understand the story, much less internalize it? Your goal when constructing any story that you're going to use in your interviews should be to reduce the information asymmetry that exists between you and the interviewer by focusing on the questions that any rational leader would ask if they were trying to assess and understand what you did, why you did it, and how you did it. This is the basis of my entire STAR Fact framework. The biggest reason you won't realize your information shortfall is because you're spending so much time preparing for your interview. You're up to your ears in preparation. Let me guess. You're writing out long answers to imagined questions that might or might not get asked in the interview. How's that doc file treating you? Maybe you tried to do this in Excel and you also realize that Excel is a terrible editing experience. It's almost as if we've all done this and we're doing it wrong. You're spending so much time with your vision, preparing your vision, your story, and thinking about what you're trying to communicate that you're forgetting that you and the interviewer, you might not even know the same songs. Bringing it back to our game here, when you tap on the table, you actually have no idea, none, what the interviewer is hearing. Or rather, when you tell your story, the interviewer has no idea if the problem was important, who the customer was, why that problem needed to be solved at that time, why the problem hadn't been addressed before, what your decision-making process was in arriving at that solution, what alternatives you considered and rejected, what the outcome was, how the outcome measured up to your initial expectations from planning. You're so focused on telling the interview everything that they can know, you forgot to script the story to what they need to know, which is the format they expect. What they absolutely do not want is a rambling, non-linear story of all the things. Your lack of editing is highlighting the fact that your story format is unfamiliar to the interviewer. This is what's known as the exposure effect, which found that the more often somebody hears something or is exposed to something, the more positively predisposed they are to have a preference for that thing. What I'm trying to help you do is understand that when you utilize a set of known and logically and likely questions to structure your storytelling, you're making your own work experience feel more known and therefore relatable. This is my STAR fact framework for story development. The entire point of the STAR fact framework is to make sure that you're answering the questions that any leader would ask when hearing someone talk about their work experience. When you craft your story to a known structure, or a structure to which all employees have ever been exposed when defending work in a performance review, you're making your story more familiar and removing the obstacles that get in the way of hearing your song. The exposure effect means that the more familiar the format and the structure of the story, the more likely the case that the interviewer will like it. This is the same regardless of nationality, sex, age, and applies to flavors, songs, ideas, stories, and even words. The more familiar, the more likely it is to be preferred. To really make this point, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Which of these two words is more likable to you? Ichtitaf or Sarik? If you're like most of the people who are going to watch this video, you said Sarik. Why? Because I used it 3 times earlier in the video. It's a made-up word. I just made it more familiar to you by using it somewhere else in the video. That way, when you heard it, you are more likely to be positively predisposed to it than the word you'd never heard before, Ichtitaf. In fact, had I used the word Sarik more in this interview, your preference actually would have gone up. The point is, don't leave the interpretation of your interview stories to chance. When you use the STAR fact structure, you are doing something that makes your story familiar to the interviewer, and you're addressing the plot points which are expected, thus making it more familiar to them and more likely that they're positively predisposed to what they're hearing from you and hearing the song that you're tapping out.